Hello and welcome at the World in Focus.
Dzień dobry, serdecznie witamy na Świecie pod lupą.
Świat pod lupą to seria debat o aktualnych wyzwaniach polityki międzynarodowej.
Wraz z wybitnymi ekspertami i ekspertkami przyjrzymy się, co czeka Europę i Polskę w zmieniającym się świecie.
Więcej na naszej stronie internetowej.
A teraz zapraszamy na kolejną dyskusję.
Hello and welcome to today's debate, World in Focus, jointly hosted by ECFR and Heinrich Böll Foundation. We're gladly welcoming two amazing speakers to this conversation. Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament, chairman of the Delegation for Relations with China, and also something that one could call Mr. China in Brussels, the one person to go to when we are discussing issues that have remotely to do with China in Brussels. And he's setting the scene and setting the conversations and driving the debates in Brussels. We will also be joined by Alexander Gabuev, who's a senior fellow and a chair of Russia and Asia Pacific in the Russia and Asia Pacific program at Carnegie. He's based in Moscow. And if we call Reinhard Mr. China, he's Mr. China Russia, definitely in the international debate, widely known and widely cited, has published all over the world, and is a well-known figure in all things Russia-China related and even beyond. He's also a senior advisor with the Albright-Stonebridge Group, knows a lot about transatlantic relations as well. So we can dive into the subjects from various angles. The Russia-China relationship is certainly a relationship that is, it is growing in importance, but is often overlooked as we are bickering in Europe about the transatlantic relationship, as we are reorganizing our relations with China. We're sort of still separating the conversations about Russia and about China. And what we want to do today is kind of bring these two elements together and say, okay, what does that specific relationship, that bilateral relationship mean for us here in Europe? Where does this take us? And at this critical day today, what is the US factor in this as well? And I would like to really kind of start with a conversation with Sasha to walk us through a little bit of what has changed in China-Russia relations in the last 4 years. Maybe what does this mean in the end for that relationship, for that bilateral relationship? Where do we stand over the course of the Trump administration over that last period of 4 years? Sasha.
Thanks, and it's very great to see you, Janka. Very great to see you, Reinhard, although it's not happening in the usual places that we gather, like Munich or somewhere else, and it's in a digital domain, but I'm very glad that we can have this important discussion, and thanks everybody for watching. I think that I would disagree with you on prioritizing this 4-year period. It's very important in the US political context because there is nothing beyond the 4-year cycle. But I think that here, the important date I would start with would be the date of Crimea annexation, 2014, and introduction of first rounds of European and American sanctions against Russia, because that was a precursor that put Russia and China on a track where they became much closer than they used to be before. But before going into that, I would probably zoom out just for a second and discuss the drivers, the more fundamental drivers of this relationship. Because I think in the West, people tend to say that it's really the American policy of antagonizing or standing up to both Russia and China simultaneously is driving the two closer together. Well, beyond that, there are like multiple mutual suspicions. There is a friendship with benefits, or there is a marriage of convenience. And I would note that marriage of convenience can sometimes much more lasting than a very passionate romance. So here, I think we have a mix of pragmatic considerations on both sides that are short-term and long-term. So to me, the three more important drivers that would put these countries on a trajectory of closer partnership, even if the US would be absent from the picture. There are three. One is security, the other is economy, the third is domestic politics. For security, the key reason is that Moscow and Beijing have been to confrontational relationship during the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s and 70s. And that turned out to be so costly and so risky for two nuclear superpowers that share a vast continental border, that once there were pragmatists and power in Beijing with Deng Xiaoping and in Moscow with Gorbachev, both decided that this confrontation absorbs so many resources that need to be put elsewhere, that they decided to de-escalate tensions, sort out the territorial issue, and as much as they can demilitarize the border. And that's what they did. So basically, Putin and Xi and Hu Jintao before him inherited this policy from their predecessors. And the policy goes back to the late 80s. If we are looking for Mr. Putin's genuine foreign policy accomplishments, I mean that settling the border dispute with China back in 2004 was really one of the major achievements. Imagine Russia trying to negotiate a border treaty with China right now, with the disparity between the two and the power gap between the two widening every other year. So both countries decided that they should not be always with each other, but never against each other. And that's the bottom line. So going back to confrontation is not the option because it's too risky and too dangerous. Number two is the economic pillar, and that's a natural mutual compatibility between the two economies. Russia is a big supplier of raw materials. China is a big consumer. And Russia is blessed to sit between the two giant markets in European Union and China. And historically, it's been putting all of its eggs into basket Europe for logistics reasons, for the reasons that there is like proximity or similarities in culture. And Europe has been historic markets for Russian commodities for many years, and definitely for hydrocarbons for the last couple of decades, where China started to import hydrocarbons only in 1994, when Russia was in the midst of very violent privatization and nobody was long strategic thinking enough to discuss pipelines going to China. So now Russia is gradually rebalancing its relationship, and the ideal picture then people in the government have is to have 40% of your trade with European Union, 40% with China, and 20% with the rest of the world. That's kind of the goal. But still, there is China now holds roughly 20% of Russia's foreign trade. So still there is enormous room to ship more oil, gas, metals, agriculture products to China. And China's market is there, although there are some frictions, but we won't go beyond that. And then on domestic politics, I think that it's also a very important driver because Moscow and Beijing share their outlook on the world. There is never a very painful moment that a Western leader standing together with Xi Jinping or with Vladimir Putin will be asked the question, what about the gay people in Chechnya? What about people in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region? What about Hong Kong? So these questions would never pop up in private conversations between the leaders or in a kind of press conference. And they also share a lot of their assessment of what's, for example, going on in Hong Kong. The Russians would say, hey, that's a Western plot to undermine the rise of China. We clearly know that because we've seen that in Ukraine on Maidan. So that's a very shared matrix and lens for which they look at the world. And then that also adds another very important layer here, is that on discussions on global commons, when it comes to issues like internet governance or R2P, Russia and China naturally find themselves in the same boat as members of P5. So I think that these three pillars are very important. And even if the US would not be in the picture, the two countries still would come much closer together than they used to be 10 years ago. And then annexation of Crimea and Russia's rupture with the West was really a trigger that forced Moscow to come closer to Beijing. Before doing that, Moscow did a pretty meticulous, by Russian standards, risk assessment of a deeper partnership with China. And it came to the conclusion that neither Chinese demographic inroads into Russia nor Chinese growing economic footprint in Central Asia, nor Chinese ability to kind of copycat some of the Russian weapon system should be an obstacle for deepening ties, because these three factors are either non-existent, so they're Asian history, like Chinese demographic presence in the Russian Far East, or there are things that are beyond the Kremlin's control. For example, Chinese growing economic clout in Central Asia. So after 4 years, what we see now is that we see a much more robust partnership, which starts to be more strategic, but is at the same time increasingly asymmetric, where Russia is a neither partner and is a weaker partner in this relationship that China has. China plays an increasingly strong hand. So manifestation for that economic dependency and asymmetry is that in 2013, before war in Ukraine, China was 10% of Russia's trade. Now it's 20%, and the share is growing at the expense of the European Union. For China, Russia is roughly 2.5%, and that share is stable. We see a growing coordination in the security domain. We see growing number of joint military drills. We see resumed arms sales, like of the most advanced Russian weaponry being sold to China. And we see increased push for joint operations and developing interoperability. For example, joint air patrol over the South Korean territories, or the territories that are disputable between ROK and Japan, done together by the Russians and the Chinese. And we see some exchange of information on intelligence, and particularly counterintelligence. There was a very interesting topic of how much Russia and China cooperate on disinformation in Europe, but we can talk about this later. I'm not 100% convinced as for now. So I think that this relationship is there to stay. It's probably becoming stronger, and it's really will be determined by the level of Russia's confrontation with the West and China's confrontation with the West. I'll stop here.
And before we I would like to ask you as well what you think, Europe should do about this, or what it means for Europe. Maybe you can just say, you can just sketch out what are the two things that you think Europe needs to watch out for in this relationship before we then turn it over to Reinhard Bütikofer to comment on what, from a Brussels perspective, what this changing relationship, this growing partnership, this robust partnership, what that means for the EU and maybe also for EU-China policy. But maybe, Sasha, maybe just 2 points that you think we need to be kind of mindful of from a European perspective.
I think one point is a perspective where Russia and large swaths of post-Soviet space might be absorbed into a realm that is dominated by China geoeconomically, where China sets the rules, set the standards for technology, connectivity, crossing of goods, like what I call Pax Sinica, using primarily geoeconomic tools, trade, finance, and technology. And then I think that it also plays a role in the technological debate. 5G is very good example here, where the demonstrative fact that Russia, a proud, technologically somewhat sophisticated superpower, has no problem with 5G, will have a very huge impact on the decisions to be made by South Africa, Brazil, and many other developing nations in the world.
So it's more the ripple effects on kind of the rest of the world and the global power projection that this kind of entails and manifests. Reinhard, maybe over to you from your perspective, from Brussels. So what do you think from your China watching that you're doing, or the outlook that you're taking on global politics at the moment? What does that growing relationship between China and Russia mean for Europe and the European Union?
Thank you, Janka, and thanks to the organizers for having me. I'm really happy to be able to discuss here on a panel with Alexander, because I'm a fond reader of what he publishes. And let me start by relating 3 short episodes. One is about what Alexander said about the age of confrontation between China and Russia is over. This is from 2010 at a meeting in Beijing. The representative of the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia took the floor and apologized to Chinese comrades for the polemics that they had been waging against the CCP during the polemics over the general line in the 60s. And the Chinese were just bewildered. They didn't even remember. And the second episode is from the early days of the BRI, when BRI was still OBOR, and Xi Jinping had to send his chief of staff to Moscow to make Putin happy by telling him that he has been included in the Belt and Road strategy. Even though I think the change in relationship is aptly reflected in the fact that 15 years ago, the Eurasian conversation would have been a Russian-dominated conversation, and today it is a Chinese-dominated conversation. And the third episode is from a visit and a conversation with the deputy foreign minister of Russia about 2 years ago, when I questioned him very precisely on China issues, and he never allowed a single ray of daylight between the Russian position and the Chinese position. And even where he did not actively say, yes, we share the same view, he refused to even allow a small thought of possible divergence. So I think that indeed the reasons that Sasha has mentioned, economic complementarity, authoritarian partnership, revisionism partnership, and the fact that both are disruptors of multilateralism creates a very strong bond. And I believe that this gives Russia depth vis-a-vis the EU, and it gives China footholds. So for instance, when China can team up with Russia to do naval exercises in the Baltic, probably without Russia, they wouldn't be doing that. So clearly they're both benefiting in their relationship with the EU. I believe, however, that this relationship is so strong that it is a foolish illusion to believe that we could lure one partner away from the other. Having discarded that idea, I think what the implications for EU policy are, I would respond with two ideas. Number one, I find that there are many spaces along the Eurasian arc where the US is not investing as much today as they would have in the past. Armenia and Azerbaijan, that conflict is an example. Kyrgyzstan, there are others. And I think one reaction that the European Union could consider would be whether there is a chance for Europe filling some of the space that the US leaves open, instead of allowing Russia and China and Turkey and others to fill that space. And the second element for a European response, and that then has a strong China policy tilt, is I believe in the realm of the Indo-Pacific conversation. I strongly believe that for Europe to play an active role, not just sit on the sidelines complaining about what others do, there would be a strong imperative to invest heavily into its connectivity strategy, and in particular into its own connectivity partnerships, in particular with Japan, India, and the ASEAN community. I believe that this would give Europe scope to mirror, in a way, what the Russians and the Chinese are doing, because by aligning their efforts, they are able to play on the European theater and on the East Asian theater at the same time. And I think if we want to respond to that, we have to find cooperation with other partners that would allow us to do the same.
And if we moved like a little bit back to the bilateral relationship per se, and we look at the security realm a little bit here. Alex, when you look at the, you've alluded to kind of the joint military maneuvers. Reinhard, you've also talked about the maneuvers in the Baltic Sea, military operations that take place together. You've also talked a little bit about, Alex, about kind of arms exports and technology cooperation in that regard. My question would be, does the cooperation really make, who does that cooperation make stronger at the moment? In the economic realm, I think that that's pretty clear. We can say that, you know, China's been growing stronger and stronger and stronger, and Russia has been kind of the junior partner in this. In the security cooperation, is that also the case? Is that the same dynamic? Or is actually China making Russia a lot stronger in that regard? And is that something that the Europeans, especially in Eastern Europe, should also be worried about? What about Russian military capacities? Are they growing because of the cooperation with China? Is that something that we should be concerned about here in Europe? Or is it the other way around? Is that a lot of kind of China that is going to be strengthened, and it's more of a regional Asian conversation that we should have? What do you think, Alex?
I think that all of the China watchers have this familiar trope that win-win cooperation is a cooperation where China wins twice. But I think that for the economy here, it's something very beneficial for both, frankly. That yes, there is this asymmetry and it's growing, but at the same time, it allows Russia to diversify some of its resources and also to sell resources in Siberia that would have no other markets than China. We can discuss whether selling it only to China through a direct pipeline that links to one customer is a smart strategy, or Russia should have been building pipelines that connected to the Pacific shore, but that's unfortunately passed and this option is no longer available. So I think that on the economy, we have a pretty mixed bag, which is really beneficial for both sides. On the military, I think that so far, it's really China that benefits most and that gets very valuable advanced weapons that it cannot get anywhere except for Russia because of the embargo still in place or because US pressure on its allies. And then Russia, I think, had a lot of second thoughts about a decade ago about selling those weapons to China. But now the outlook and the way the government looks at this is very simple. We have a window of opportunity of about 10, 15 years where China will get there. So they will be able to produce their own good engines for fighter jets. They will be able to produce good surface-to-air missiles with or without us. So it's better to do that with us, so and we can sell as much as we can. And as we do that, the other countries that are not the Western allies, but also have issues with China, like India or Vietnam, will knock on Moscow's door and ask for the very same systems. And that's a kind of very short-termist, very Russian, but a beneficial cycle for the military-industrial complex. China is getting the Su-35, the S-400, something that they clearly need right now if they are to fortify their positions in the South China Sea, in the Strait of Taiwan, or in the Senkaku. So I think that's of real importance for them. Number two is more strategic cooperation in areas like unveiled by Putin last year during Valdai. That's the Russian help on building the early warning system to warn the Chinese government of incoming American missiles. And that's really is a very important element to build a credible nuclear deterrent on par with the deterrents that Russia and the United States now have. And then third is the interoperability of the forces, which I think Reinhard mentioned in the NAVIT maneuvers offshore of UK and the Nordics. But I think that we are seeing a lot of effort to build at least limited ability to do stuff and fight together. So both countries are not forming a military like NATO type or even Quad type alliance relationship. So there will be no formal obligations, although it's very interesting that 2 weeks ago, Putin has addressed Valdai. He was asked this question by a Chinese scholar, Yan Suetun, dear colleague of mine at Carnegie, who is known as an advocate for Russia-China military alliance. But in China, that's kind of a minority view. And then Putin suddenly jumped on this idea and said for the first time in history that I cannot rule this out. And we're not contemplating this at the moment, but it really depends on the situation in the world. And to me, he's sending a very strong signal to Europeans and Americans saying, hey, help me. Like if you have a problem and if you're taking hostage, wink. So he is not winking and he's not taking hostage, but he's trying to play this desire to explore the opportunity to tear this kind of partnership apart and provide Moscow some incentives. And I somewhat agree with Reinhard and somewhat disagree, but we can talk about this later.
We will definitely get into this later, but I would like to hear Reinhard's views about the question of whether, does that change something about the way we look at EU-China policy? Because I do think that the security factor has often been one that has been pushed aside, where the question has been, yes, and China's a cybersecurity challenge, but not really a hard security challenge. Does the assessment of strengthened China-Russia military cooperation change something about that equation in the European debate?
I recall a conversation with a Shanghai think tanker many years ago when he tried to make fun of the Americans by arguing that they tried to build, he said, a wall in the east while not defending the wall in the west and letting that dilapidate. And he really chuckled. And in a way, this cooperation allows China to more strongly use that kind of a stratagem, because and we've seen that in the speculation around the tensions over the Taiwan Strait. People have speculated, and I think they're ahead of their time, but still, what if there's a mess as the Americans may take a month or so to decide who would be president in January? Would the Chinese take advantage of that and try to use force vis-a-vis Taiwan? I don't expect that at the moment, but in that very conversation, some people said, yes, and what if Russia would then take the opportunity, grab the opportunity of moving on the Western Front, on its Western Front, in the Baltic region. And obviously, the cooperation with China does, beyond defense procurement and everything, does give some additional strategic space to Russia for geopolitical adventurism. And I think that has an implication for the EU.
And what is that implication?
As I said, that we cannot talk European security as if it was sort of an isolated issue, that the aligning of those two revisionist powers forces us to also look at the connex between our security and East Asian security.
Does that make, and that's my last question to you before I turn it back to Alex, but does that make China a topic for NATO as well? Because that would be the logical consequence, obviously, if NATO is an alliance directed at the Russian threat, then if Russia and China cooperate more closely, does that put China on the agenda for NATO just much more strongly than it is at the moment?
China has been on the agenda for NATO, but I don't expect NATO to ever, over the next few years, find consensus on dealing with China. But of course, there are many dimensions besides NATO. And when you listen to the German Minister of Defense, she has given a speech in the Bundestag. I think it was mentioned in another conversation we both attended to the other day, where she said, "Yeah, and we will have a naval presence, and that can be translated by saying ships." So it becomes a conversation.
It changes the kind of the parameters of the conversation, definitely. Yep. Alex, you said you disagree with some of the things that Reinhard has said, and let's stay in that security space for just one more kind of round, and then we will move on to some technology questions because they are super relevant as well. Before you do that, just let me remind everyone that obviously you are welcome to ask questions and send them via the chat functions, and then they will be fed into my chat feed, and I can read them out and ask them to the speakers. So please do that. Please do engage if you have questions. But Alex, over to you. So where do you agree? Where do you disagree?
I think that's a broader point that Reinhard made about the two being so close together that any kind of attempt to lure one party from another is doomed to fail. I agree with this general assessment. I think that the fundamentals are really strong, and that trying to drive a wedge or do Kissinger reverse whatever wouldn't work. However, I think that at least for Russia, where I'm kind of more confident, I think that there is an internal discussion on the limits of partnership with China. As people understand that the rivalry between the US and China is of paramount importance, that might take different forms and shapes and last for some decades. But it's really something where Russia's optimal strategy would be not to be sucked in too deeply and choose a side. And then animosity towards the US is something inbuilt, but there are some people who advocate for more pragmatic relationship, at least has some guardrails, like arms control, like some norms in the cyberspace. They are probably not the majority, but there are some important voices in the decision-making circles. And at the same time, this view is really very much very much relevant because of the discussion of how much this asymmetry with China will pose a security challenge for us, or broader challenge for us 10, 15 years down the road. So now it's really mutually beneficial. Russia has enough of strategic autonomy to push back at some initiative that China wants to impose on Russia. For example, China says, we are hosting a digital convention of all the foreign ministers of BRI member states, and Russia should join. And Russia said, wait a minute, we are not a BRI participant. We have a dock-in between the Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI. So these are equal projects, and we are happy to host a separate meeting where you are not the host and we are not a guest, but we are co-owners, and then we can invite the Stans and other members to kind of sit at the table. But we are not joining at Lavrov's level to this summit, although we will not ignore it. So Russia sent a special envoy in charge of BRI. So I think that Russia has enough kind of power to do these symbolic gestures to show that it's independent. But what about 10, 15 years down the road? What about if Russia is really successful and 40% of Russia's trade is with China? What about if Russia's 5G is built on Huawei or Chinese standard? Then probably Chinese leverage will be very much at use. And I don't think that anybody in the Kremlin makes an illusion that China will be shy and will respect Russian national interests and will not push Russia into the corner on some issues that are of vital interest of China. For example, like the example I've heard from someone is like, what if 10 years down the road, China says, Russia should stop selling your weapons to India. You should just choose which market you prefer, a multi-billion-dollar arms market with China, where we are jointly co-developing some stuff, or market it with India. You should stop it. You should stop supporting Vietnam, or you should make a statement that you understand and support the 9 dash line. So these are scenarios that are probably 10, 15 years down the road, but they depend on the actions and the course that the Kremlin is taking now. So I think that this kind of over-dependence of Russia on China is something that is neither in Russia's interest and neither in Europe's interest. So we can have a more pragmatic debate on which aspects of the relationship are really a challenge for the European Union, where European Union has tools and control to not disentangle Russia from China, but at least stop the partnership at the current level and not deepen that. And that would be a pragmatic conversation that's, I think, has more realism to me than the broad vision of one of the European presidents here in one of the influential English weeklies that, oh, Russia doesn't want to be a slave with China. That's why we should embrace the Kremlin once again.
So what would those areas be? Just if you can be just super precise, if you say, so these three areas are areas in which it would be very wise for the European Union to step up their game vis-a-vis cooperation with Russia, because it would actually have an impact on the deepening of the cooperation with China, and it would serve multiple geopolitical purposes, and it would be worth it in that regard.
Let me give you one example. That would be rare earth. The whole rare earth industry is by and large controlled by China. They don't mine all the rare earth, but the first 3 or 4 steps of processing are concentrated in China to more than 95% each. Now the Russians, as well as the Americans, are taking steps to develop their own rare earth policy and their rare earth industry. And I think that could be an issue where the Europeans, that of course depend a lot on rare earth, would have a practical interest in teaming up with Russia.
And Sasha, you had a few ideas as well, I think, of practical steps to take.
Yeah, I think that an honest transatlantic discussion on the efficiency of sanctions and how much piling up one sanctions package after another really changes Russia's behavior or produces side effects like Russia-China rapprochement is long overdue. And unfortunately, right now, European Union doesn't have a good partner across the pond to like have a quite serious conversation on this, but it might get one soon. We don't know yet. So I think that if the sanctions, the future sanctions, we're not talking about changing the current sanctions. They're there to stay for sure. But like, what if 5G equipment becomes part of the sanctions? And for example, Nokia and Ericsson won't be able to sell or surface the hardware they are selling to the Russian market. So that's part of the discussion, internal discussion in Russia. So yes, we don't want to be entirely in Huawei's pocket. But what if we buy something from European vendors and then out of a sudden we poison another Navalny or we do something, and then 5G is designed as a strategic area where we need to kind of diminish Russian advances, and that's sanctioned. So we either cannot buy or the equipment that we've bought is sunk cost. So I think that discussing in serious fashion what are the sectors that need to be targeted with future sanctions and what should be kind of where sanctions should have no use. I think that's at least one small step. And then weaponization of the Euro system, because what we've seen is that for China-Russia trade, there is a very deliberate effort to move beyond US dollar. And that has been achieved. So the US dollar share has fallen beyond 50% and it's shrinking. But it has been replaced by euros, not by the yuan, because yuan is not a fully convertible currency. So the share of yuan and ruble in bilateral trade is growing, but it's not a very convenient currency. So both Russian and Chinese companies are doing more transactions in euros. So if Russia doesn't have access to both euros and US dollars and probably Japanese yen, then Russia will have to accept the terms of trade in RMB, which will be entirely written by Beijing. And I don't think that this is something that is to European interests. So I think that these two areas, at least technology and financial leverage, should be discussed properly.
How likely, Reinhard, do you think that the idea of kind of finding areas of strategic cooperation with Russia under the whole kind of China umbrella is going to fly in Europe? How is that going to be seen, especially among Eastern European partners? How is that going to have potentially an effect on EU unity in these questions?
I must confess that I'm pretty skeptical there, because well, in the environment that I know best in the European Parliament, there often is almost no understanding between some of the colleagues from Eastern Europe, in particular the Polish and people from the Baltic republics on one side, and some of the colleagues from the Iberian Peninsula or France on the other. And I would assume that it would be the task of the German leaders to build a bridge between those very distinct views of Russia. And at the moment, I don't see that happening. But if Berlin would invest into that, that would still take quite an effort. But to be this unpolite, between the French and the Polish, it's hard to see that they could find an agreement.
Two fingers on this, Janka. I think
Please
that framing this as a kind of, we need to change our Russia policy, like we as Europe, in order to kind of prevent Russia-China access to getting deeper, is a wrong-footed way to put it. And again, the discussion should be about very granular look on very precise policy issues that should be addressed in order to prevent Russia deeper sliding into China's pocket. It shouldn't mean, from the European vantage point, that Europe should forget about Crimea, or should abolish support for Ukraine, or should tolerate everything what Russia does now and then. If Russia and Europe should come to terms and agreement and mutual compromise, that's a different thing. That's a very nice thing to have. I don't think that we're going to have that in the foreseeable future, but it's still worth talking about some rules of engagement. But that should be a separate discussion from the things we discuss, that some very precise measures to kind of stop deepening of China-Russia access, particularly in the military and the technological domain.
If I may add one sentence to that, Janka, I think there's also a transatlantic dimension to this. Over recent years, increasingly, you've seen tendencies in Poland and some of the Baltic countries to rely more directly on bilateral relations with the United States. And if we don't have a partner on the other side of the pond that understands that it would be also in the interest of the United States to have a united Europe, that could make it very difficult for the EU to come up with a Russia policy, even on the very cautious terms that Sasha has described.
Let's focus a little bit on technology, because we have talked about it a bit in various ways about it a little bit, but I do think that that's one of the key dimensions of the bilateral relationship. And I would be super interested, Sasha, if you can kind of illuminate us a little bit about what does that technology ecosystem at the moment look like between China and Russia? Because at the moment, one can, if I would say like very bluntly, one could say maybe very like simplifying things, China has a lot of cash. And Russia has a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of human power. There's a lot of engineers. There's a lot of knowledge available. And that makes a pretty good mix in a way for moving forward with innovation. What does that mean at the moment? How does that technological innovation environment look like between China and Russia at the moment?
I think that historically, both Russian and Chinese IT companies and innovation companies have looked elsewhere and not at each other. So they are both were looking Silicon Valley, US, Europe to some extent, Israel and other places, but not really at each other. Right now, I think that there is a big drive on the Russian side to look at the Chinese, and they don't only have cash, they have really very good startups. There is an indigenous innovation culture in Shenzhen and other places. There are genuine know-hows that are not only borrowed from somewhere, but are indigenously produced. And there are multi-billion growing businesses where bits and bytes of Russian know-hows and technology can be sold or can be implemented as a joint value chain between the two countries. So that's the Russian view. And then I think that the Chinese view is also changing because of the decoupling. What I hear from some people in Beijing working in tech, like 5G is again a very good example, is that they say, we know that this administration or the next administration will continue its course to quietly squeeze us out and push us out of the US. So probably we'll be not able to send our PhD students to MIT to get their degrees in engineering and mathematics in that large quantities or at all. And like many of our companies will be kicked out of the Silicon Valley. So that's the expectation. And the expectation is that Europeans may fall in line. So what they need is that they say, we have a lot of cash, we have industrial capacity, we have a lot of team of Chinese engineers, both internationally and domestically trained. What we need is a set of engineers who are trained very differently and have very different outlook of things, very different metrics to approach the same technological problems that can really share with us and be teams working in parallel or one team working in tandem. And when we look at the global map, we see not that many countries which have this capacity to do so. And Russia is definitely among them. So Huawei now is tripling its research staff in Russia. It's expanding its partnership with universities. And like a lot of, like my junior brother was interning, like he is in the voice recognition and music recognition in the best engineering school in Russia. So he was a summer intern for Huawei this summer. And that's a very attractive package to lure kids like him to work for Huawei. He quit and he's now looking for a job probably in the Silicon Valley. But it's interesting and it's very telling how strategic China is in approaching that. And I think that there are real synergies that that would be there, but are amplified by the current geopolitical trends.
Reinhard, are we overlooking the decoupling tendencies, the effect that the decoupling tendencies may have on forging that alliance? Is that something that we're not paying enough attention to in Europe?
Well, I would push back against the notion that what China does with regard to its nationalist economic strategies is just a reaction to our decoupling. China started decoupling before we knew the word. But certainly now they have forged a new strategy. The dual circulation strategy basically says that's Mao Zedong's independence strategy for the 21st century. I have not seen any in the sources that I follow any particular emphasis on a Russian leg to that dual circulation strategy, but I could well imagine that this could be a development that we will encounter, and we should certainly watch that.
We have a question here from the audience. Someone is not convinced. The comment is from Rafael Korzeniewski, and I'm butchering the name. I'm very sorry. He's not convinced about the Sino-Russian alliance. He doesn't believe that this will actually have substance to it because the countries are too different, that there are reasons to complain to countries not being perfect democracies but that doesn't make them strategic allies. I think that, this is a general question a bit about the conversation of in the China-Russia conversation with the China-Russia watcher community is, do we take it seriously? Do we not take it seriously? I think, Alex, you have alluded to it in the beginning very strongly and saying, we have to take it seriously. It is growing, it's emerging, and it's stronger than it was before. What do you say to the critics to convince them of kind of your argument and saying, well, this is really important and this is something that is deeper than you think it may be?
First, we should differentiate between apples and oranges, right? It's not an alliance. It's not an Article 5 type of security assurances that both countries want to give each other. And again, Putin played with that metaphor, in my view, to send a strong signal to Western capitals that Russia's China policy can be affected to some extent, and that the United States shouldn't do this and that to make that alliance closer. But that's not an alliance. Both countries have strategic autonomy. and both countries have disagreements. For example, China doesn't recognize Crimea as a Russian territory, although it helped to supply the electric cable that helped to overcome the blockade that was imposed by the Ukrainian government. Russia doesn't recognize the 9-dash line. It doesn't recognize Chinese claims in the South China Sea, although it supplies weapons that will help the PLA Navy to establish more control. So they don't necessarily agree with each other on everything, but for the reasons that they strengthen each other's resources, the way we discussed with Reinhard. And the non-alliance pact is the critical element. The non-aggression pact, what it de facto is a very serious element for a force planner. So if you are a Pentagon force planner and you have Russia doing military drills somewhere in its western flank, closer to the Baltics or Polish border and stuff, you cannot reallocate all of your, or like bulk of your forces to the Pacific theater. That's clear. So it's exactly how the Russia-China question becomes a NATO question and a question for force planners. So I think that's serious and that needs to be addressed. And then again, there are tensions, there are disagreements, but the long-term obstacles for this relationship, for example, the fear that, oh, China is going to invade Siberia or it's populating Siberia already. All of the figures available show that the Chinese population in Siberia is shrinking. Guess why? Well, Chinese population is aging. Its GDP ratio, like in the last 5-year plan, I think the average GDP grew like 6.7%. This year it's going to grow 2%. Russia's GDP was growing 1.5%, and then it's not growing this year. It's probably will be in a negative territory by 5%. Russia used to be, as an economy, used to be size of Guangdong province. Now it's size of Shandong province and moving like direction Hubei. So there is much more attractive job opportunities for Chinese coming from the Northeast China at home rather than to be in a hostile foreign country. So we see a lot of migration from the other way, like Chinese who resided in Russia going back, and they're substituted by tourists, or used to be substituted by tourists. So I think that there are a lot of fears that Russia previously had that are no longer there, which makes this partnership more stronger. But again, the asymmetry will remain and increase.
How much does that have to do with respect as well? With kind of taking, what I'm kind of alluding at is China behaving cleverly towards Russia because it's showing a degree of respect that may not necessarily be proportionate to the economic importance that Russia has for China, but kind of underlining the strategic factor a lot more and is playing the psychology right.
I think it's really like they know that Russians have a huge ego and China is very good at massage. So I think that Chinese are best in massaging the Russian ego very skillfully. At the same time, there is a genuine assessment that Russia can never be neglected. Russia always appears weaker than it actually is and has this ability to concentrate its limited resources and do something that will surprise the Chinese because the risk-taking calculation is still very different. So Russia should be, as my Carnegie boss, Dmitry, very eloquently put, handled with care. And that's what they do. Also being very pragmatic and getting the benefits that they want. I don't think that any Russian leader or any senior official or senior business figure I talk to at least is under illusion that China has a genuine respect for Russia. They believe that the Chinese are very pragmatic, very selfish, and very strategic in their outlook, and that's normal. So they care about interests of their country. Why should they care about the Russians? But they also think that this emotional irritant, this high kind of demands, or like Reinhard exchange with Lavrov, right? Something very emotional. And like the Russian officials being angry, why you Europeans put these demands forward? Like you have friends in the Middle East, or you Americans have Saudi Arabia as an ally for God's sake. Like, why are you pointing always to us? Like this emotional level, which makes Russians super angry at Europeans and Americans, is absent from the relationship. And I think that's providing a lot of kind of stabilizing, at least on psychological, stabilizing power to the relationship.
I see Reinhard smiling, so I think he has a comment to this. Is that something that we can learn?
I was just thinking by myself that, well, expressing this sardonically, I would say I would trust the Chinese to not be capable of showing too much respect to any other country in the medium and long term.
There is a question here from Roy Yu that he's asking, and I think this is a good question for Reinhard Bütikofer. Many Eastern member states in the European Union have expressed their disappointment over China's Belt and Road Initiative, as many projects and FDIs have failed to sort of materialize. Arguably, as a result as well, there is a new political dimension to this, and we saw that in the Czech Senate President's visit to Taipei in October. Do you think that, and that's the question of Roy Yu, do you think that China's economic statecraft would actually translate into political influence in the Eastern member states of the European Union? And how does that relate to kind of, I would like to add, how does that relate to the broader China-Russia dimension to this? Because there used to be a time before, I would say around 2015, where there was a relatively pro-Chinese view in Eastern European member states, but still a very skeptical view of Russia. Is that view converging now? What do you think?
I see increasing convergence indeed. Also, by the way, from the other side, the Germans have always played a very particular role with a extremely fortunate level of complementarity of the two economies that's also sort of not stable, and Germans are becoming more European, so to speak. But also from the side of Central and Eastern European countries, when the 16 plus 1 was started, 2011, I think it was, there were extremely high flying expectations, and they basically have not materialized. The 17 plus 1 is a pretty empty exercise at the moment. And on the other hand, what is also feeding into this is the fact that the EU has started understanding that it has to become more proactive. So the huge investment program that is being set up for the Western Balkans is not just because we have finally found our love for the Serbs and the Montenegro people, but it's a direct reaction to the understanding that China is beginning to play an extremely strong role in this European backyard, even if the expectations of those countries are still being disappointed. So on one hand, China is not delivering what they seemed to be promising. On the other hand, the European Union is proactively engaging more. That allows for more cohesion. I see a lot of voices today that when we have discussions in the European Parliament over Hong Kong, over Xinjiang, it's exactly the same kind of people that are the most critical of Russia or Putin's policy towards Belarus or Putin's policy in Libya or in Syria, that are also on the forefront of criticism towards China. So in a way, there has been a homogenizing of those two perspectives.
There is another question, one for Alex Gabuev here from Plamen Tonchev, who's a fellow researcher currently at Merix as a fellow there, and he's asking whether China is working on the development of, and it's to you, Alex, it's a train question. China is working on the development of multi-gauge trains, which should be able to travel on the Russian railway track without a stop at Khorgos. Would this boost trade volume along those routes? And would this have any implications in terms of Russia's national security? A very specific train question to you.
I think that it might, although the major obstacles there are lack of like really sizable volumes of the cargo for those trains. So there are some ideas how to fill them with agricultural goods and other stuff, but I think that the Russian railways and the Kazakh Timirjali, the Kazakhstani monopoly, and their joint logistic operator have troubles in finding enough cargo, and that will require a lot of additional investment in logistical terminals and freezers if we are talking about some meat products and stuff to send them way China. But that definitely will simplify or remove at least one of the kind of technological hurdles. And I think that for Russia, the anathema was China building tracks on internationally recognized standards, because Russia is really very keen on defending this space, which is kind of the Tsarist or Soviet technological standards. So I think that Chinese, as pragmatic people, found a way to avoid that. There was an earlier technology developed by Koreans, so it might help with to some extent only.
Maybe before we get into more questions from the audience, so just please keep them coming. We'll be happy to answer them. I would like to use the opportunity of this being a pretty special day. I mean, this is not only the 3rd of November, but this is also election day. And here in Germany, where I'm based at the moment, we have been kind of waiting for this day for 4 years, but also kind of dreading the results that may come about tonight, or maybe not tonight. So I do think that we have already kind of alluded to the transatlantic factor in the relationship. But on a day like this, we probably cannot avoid to talk at least a little bit about what the outcome of this election will mean for either China or Russia, or both of, or the bilateral relationship. And I would like to start with Alex maybe here, and then get to Reinhard to kind of get your assessment of, so what do you think? What does it mean for China? What does it mean for Russia? And what does that mean for the specific relationship between the two?
Thanks for not asking me to kind of try to predict and guess. I don't do these bets.
No, I'll do that later.
Okay, so I'm here viewed as a Russian, right, who would definitely know the outcome of American presidential elections. Okay, so I guess that with Biden, with Trump, the expectation is pretty low, and people in Moscow believe that the relationship will get worse before it gets worse under Donald Trump, with sanctions being continued to piling up, with what has remained from the arms control going out of window. So it's going to go into, or it risks to go into, a much darker place than we are now. And then 4 years of Trump have been a disaster for US-Russia relationship. The upside of this is the schadenfreude that some members of the Russian elite have when they watch the US collapsing. At least that's kind of the feeling. So the transatlantic order is in disarray. All the partnerships are falling apart. Probably the Europeans will want to get more independence, and that probably they will try to coexist with us on the Eurasian landmass. So that's kind of the hopes, like the big hopes. The smaller hopes that the US will be so perplexed with its own business that it doesn't have enough focus to kind of prevent us from rising or from doing stuff that we want. But then there is a very clear understanding that the bilateral relationship will become worse. With Biden, I think that it may come in two shapes. I think that the dominant view is that Biden is bad because that means more sanctions, more punishment. There are people who are very angry at what Russia did in 2016, who will might occupy many prominent positions in the new administration, and they will continue to kind of take their revenge on Russia. So that, I think that's the dominant view, and that's also priced in the markets. I think that there is a more sophisticated and nuanced view, which says, well, there are no friends of Russia in the future Biden administration, but there might be some very experienced practitioners who are American patriots who know Russia very well, have very good network of contacts here, and who are respected in Russia, who will try to find these guardrails and try to prevent this relationship from going into a much darker spot, because that also entails risks for America and its allies. and they will be pragmatic. They will also have support of their allies in Europe, which will make this policy much more coherent. So you finally will have somebody to discuss issues with INF or the START Treaty or cybersecurity. And also Biden will be not limited by suspicions that he's a Russian asset. So he can have this conversation with the Congress and with allies. That will probably bring some normality. I think that Russia-China relationship really will be impacted by this, whether there will be some opening to kind of at least normalize and stabilize the relationship in its current terrible spot and prevent it from becoming even more toxic, or it will be a downward spiral. So I think that further rapprochement with China will be impacted by this, and also by the kind of type of competition strategy that the US chooses to kind of address China challenge. And that's really up in the air.
Reinhard, what do you think?
Well, I don't really have a very good idea of what Biden's Russia policy could be. I guess an indicator could be early on whether he allows members of Congress to continue with the anti-Nord Stream 2 activities. He hasn't given clear signals, as far as I know, in that regard. But so far, this tough American position has been supported by Democratic senators just as much as it has been by their Republican colleagues. So that might be an indication where he's going to go. And then what I would find interesting is whether Biden would try, or people from his camp would try to develop a new conversation with Russia about including China in nuclear disarmament efforts. That could be an interesting perspective, also for the Europeans, of course. As regards China, I think that Biden would be the more toxic option for Beijing. The probability that the EU and the United States would find ways of coming together more proactively, for instance, by cooperating inside and with international organizations like the UN and its affiliated institutions, where Trump has never really cared much of playing ball with international partners, but if Europeans and Americans would start doing that, that could have an impact on the role that China can play. Also, with regard to trade, there's a lot of common ground on WTO reform that has been obscured by some extreme positions taken by USTR over the years, but I think there could be some reconciliation. I do still think, of course, that Biden will not be a honeymoon for the Europeans. He would insist very much on Europe contributing more to its own security. He would certainly give preference to the Indo-Pacific as the most important region vis-a-vis the Atlantic, and I think he would also be tough on Europe on trade, because some of the Trump trade policies are quite popular with constituencies that he relies on. But overall, I would assume that China would be in for an unpleasant alignment between the U.S. and the EU, and since the EU has already started making very practical proposals in that regard, I think that could take off very fast.
You both mentioned, and I think that's quite interesting because it's not a topic that is normally on the top of everyone's agenda at the moment. Both have mentioned arms control as an important topic in that spectrum, in that kind of Russia, China, EU, US conundrum that we find ourselves in at the moment. How likely do you think, what do you think could be the dynamics here? Because I do think that that's an important topic for the Europeans that they want to raise, that they want to bring forward. It certainly is an opportunity, as you rightly point out, and it's in terms of the Biden administration that is going to be more focused on that potentially. But also you said, Alex, that it could be in Russia's interest, actually. Is Russia the player that could bring China on board and thereby fulfill one of the criteria that the Americans have for a kind of effective new structuring of arms control, of actually having China on board as well?
Russia definitely has not the ability to bring China to the negotiation table. And I think that was clearly stated by the Deputy Minister Ryabkov, by Lavrov, by Putin himself recently, because China has this opportunity to catch up and to build its nuclear arsenal to the same level that the US and Russia has. So why would it be interested in coming into negotiation in a weak position and limiting itself at the current level? So I think that it's very logical that China doesn't want to do so. And if the US is to lure China into negotiation, it needs to find some carrots. And I don't think that these carrots are existent. And definitely Russia understands China's position. It's not super happy about it. It probably would love to have China with the number of warheads that it has now, but it also understands that it's probably beyond Russia's control. However, I think that the conversation about the numbers and verification, like the very 20th century Cold War conversation about the nukes, is a very relevant one, and it's better to have a START treaty than have nothing. But I think that the new creative ways to talk about arms control, like something that my colleagues in Carnegie do both in Beijing and in DC, and to talk about the cyber component of attacks on the command and control of nuclear armed forces and the role of cyber in the whole debate, role of AI, role of hypersonic, role of the non-nuclear high precision hypersonic missiles, is also very interesting to the Chinese, because that's the future. And that's where they think that they have an advantage, but they also want to reach some level where they bring all the parties to the conversation and establish some rules, because that will otherwise become very costly and very risky. So there are very interesting works done by my colleagues and other colleagues on this issue. And I feel that the Chinese are very interested in the conversation. Whether Biden will find ways to bring them to the negotiation table is a very different question. And frankly, I don't think that it's limited to just Russia, China, and the United States. I think that the grievance on the Russian side and on the Chinese side is that, well, France and Great Britain are nuclear powers. Why are they not on the table? And then we all know that India and Pakistan have nukes, and that's an established fact. So they should at the table too. And that makes the whole negotiation game a very kind of fruitless and hopeless one, but definitely diplomats should try.
Fruitless and hopeless. That sounds like a job for the EU, right? What do you think, Reinhard?
Yeah, we're happy to try, yes.
There was another question that came in There was another question that came in from the audience from Yeji Dariusz. He says, has the US worked in favor of China, Russia, or against it, and wants some examples? I would kind of rephrase it a little bit maybe and just say, how much is that US factor? What are the best examples of things that the US has done that has definitely led to a phone call between Beijing and Moscow?
Well, sanctions in 2014 and the whole reaction to the Russian interpretation would be the whole reaction to the Ukraine crisis going back to 2013, to the events before the shooting on Maidan and annexation of Crimea. And that the American interpretation would be, well, the Western reaction to the violation of sovereignty of Ukraine and its territorial integrity. But I think that was a very clear example where the Western collective actions to push back against Russia forced Putin to look east. And there was this interagency study on risks of partnering with China that was kind of classified, but there are some signs that this has been done. And then in May that year, Putin went to Shanghai to CC, and they signed the Power of Siberia gas project. they agreed to resume sales of Russian weapons. That was disclosed later. So these are some very important signs here that are visible. And then on the Chinese side, I think that the conversation on purchasing the Russian technology for early warning system and many other elements, including the joint air patrol over ROK territory, was agreed after launch of trade war, and it became evident for Beijing that this is something real, something long lasting, and something that should be addressed probably with the help of the Russian partners.
Reinhard, would you like to add something to this?
No.
Okay. So I think that before I let you all go into an evening of election watching or spending wonderful quality time with your families, which is probably the better option to choose at this point in time, because we will likely not find out anything tonight, but I still, maybe a lot of us will not be able to avoid the lure of the television later this evening. I would like to take Sasha up on that comment, that I do want to have a little bit of a prediction. So what do you think, if we have a landslide Biden victory, what would be the first thing on the Russia agenda that he would be doing? And to Reinhard, maybe if we do see a landslide Biden victory, what's the first thing on the China agenda that we may see happening over the course of the first few months of the presidency?
So that's your prediction, a landslide Biden victory?
It's just a proposition at the moment. Okay. You can also happily go into what a Trump 2 scenario could look like.
I think that first there will be a lot of domestic stuff on the mind of the new administration, and then COVID, economic recovery, and then all of the kind of racial and other issues will be very high on the president and senior team's agenda. So on Russia first, they need to do a policy review and appoint officials and confirm a lot of officials. So I don't think that we will see the new Russia team before the next summer, which a lot of things can happen between now and next summer. So that's first. And then second thing is that I believe the first priorities will be the low-hanging fruits, which will be negotiation about the extension of the START treaty. I think that will be the item number one.
Reinhard, what do you think?
Similarly, I would argue that it will take some time for people in the Biden camp to sort out their internal differences. There are China hawks and China doves on his team. So just to speculate, I could imagine that he does take two steps at the same time. That one, he might signal that he is not giving up on Taiwan, that he wants to discourage Chinese pressure against Taiwan. And on the other hand, he might also relent some of the pressure that Trump has been putting on Huawei.
I would like to thank both of you for an evening full of fantastic insights. I think we could have also talked a little bit more about energy and climate and what does the decarbonization of China mean for the China-Russia relationship, and all of these topics. I think what we have managed over the last 90 minutes or so is to underline the importance of kind of looking east when we're thinking China, and not just looking far east, but kind of making a stopover in the middle as well, and thinking the Russia dimension in our strategy making and in our strategic thinking in developing European China policy. I think we could not have had a greater cast for this conversation. Thank you very much, Reinhard Bütikofer, for taking the time out of what is an incredibly busy schedule of a parliamentarian these days. Thank you very much, Sasha, for spending the evening with us. As working for an American organization, I can imagine that you probably have your phone ringing like crazy starting tomorrow morning to give interviews, commenting on the US election. Both of you will be people to follow on Twitter, on all kinds of social media outlets, and to watch out for their writings. And I'm only left to thank